Welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Hervé Amoric and we're in Sussex, in the south of England. We are guests of a former police chief who was at the forefront of the fight against terrorism at Scotland Yard in London and in Northern Ireland. Hugh Orde, welcome to France 24.
Thank you.
Since March, Britain was attacked several times in Manchester, in London. What is the best way to fight against that form of terrorism?
Well, this is a very different sort of terrorism. In Ireland, for example, the IRA, the Loyalist forces were organised. What we're now facing is disorganised terrorism. Individuals who are prepared to die for their cause. In fact, they want to die, committing one act. Not many acts, one act. So this is why we have to work very closely with the communities from which these people come and the communities where they hide. So community policing, which was a British model of policing for many years, is now more important than ever. Police and public working together to keep themselves safe.
In the Finsbury Park attack in London, Muslims were targeted, particularly targeted. What's the challenge there?
What I suspect we have seen there is someone reacting and turning to violence because of what they perceive to be the attacks committed by Muslims against anybody. I think we need to be balanced about our response. This is just another terrorist attack. It's not different. This man drove a vehicle at British citizens. The other attacks drove vehicles at British citizens. So we don't need to distinguish. We don't need to say this is something different, because we must understand the Muslim community will see it as a terrorist attack, because that's precisely what it was. So we need to do exactly the same. We need to work with communities who will know who the extreme right-wing people are in the same way they know, or they will start to be concerned about people who are perhaps becoming radicalised within their communities. And we have evidence that this is the case.
Does Britain need the kind of powers that France has, powers to detain, to search, with very little judicial overview?
We have plenty of powers to deal with terrorism. The criminal code in this country is more than sufficient. We also, of course, adhere strictly to the European code and indeed the Code of Human Rights. And that's very important, because what these people are trying to do, be they left-wing, right-wing, Muslim, far right, is they're trying to destroy our way of life and to provoke a reaction. They're also trying to provoke a state overreaction. We have seen this before. In Northern Ireland, the state overreacted and interred people in the 70s, just locked them up without trial. We've seen the same more recently in Guantanamo Bay. I was told by a very senior IRA terrorist, now, of course, a member of the local administration, in fact, a terrorist from the past who had moved his world on. He told me that the most important change for them in the IRA was internment, because it allowed them to recruit more and more people. So the state has to be very careful, and the state has to be very balanced in its response. To overreact will prolong this, not shorten it.
Some ministers, and perhaps prime ministers, believe that we have to sacrifice our individual rights to catch terrorists. What do you think?
I disagree fundamentally. The human rights of every citizen in this country are the bedrock on which we build our policing model. The police in the United Kingdom remain largely unarmed. Only about 10% of our service is armed. More are becoming armed, and more are becoming better equipped and better trained, so we can deal with this current threat. The majority of police officers do not want to be armed. They want to be in the communities with the citizens. So the more we can keep that together, the more, in my judgment, we increase our chances of success against people who will be spotted by the communities far quicker than they'll be spotted by the police. And that applies, in my judgment, be it in Paris, be it in Belgium, be it in Brussels. It's the same principle. We have to have the confidence of the local communities, who often feel disenfranchised, to enable us to get that vital intelligence that allows our specialists to act. Community policing is critical.
Britain and France are particularly targeted by terrorists. How important is the exchange of information across the Channel and across Europe between police forces and intelligence services?
Well, it's absolutely vital. So what we must ensure, whatever happens in the current negotiations, is that we maintain the very best cooperation we can, albeit at some point, at a date to be determined, we will leave the EU.
Negotiations on Britain leaving the EU have started. will it be more difficult to exchange information in the future?
Well, it's the responsibility of this government that got us into this place to negotiate the best possible deal in terms of all the security arrangements which we benefit from as members. When I was president of the Association of Chief Police Officers, which meant I represented the leadership of the police in this country, I frequently told the government that these were essential measures. If one looks at the third pillar arrangements, which actually the UK were going to opt out of before we decided to leave because of our particular agreement, I worked with my colleagues to inform the government on what was essential. And I'll tell you exactly what was essential. The European arrest warrant, critical to the safety of citizens across the EU. Europol, where we share all our intelligence, currently led by a British police officer. Now that will change. Eurojust, that allows us to share joint investigations so we can instantly act as one police force. And the information agreements. That will have to be renegotiated. And in my judgment, we cannot have the same relationship because we're no longer in the club.
Can Britain be part of Europol without being part of the EU?
Well, that's a matter for the negotiations. In my judgment, I think that's very difficult.
In her letter to trigger the proceedings of Brexit, Theresa May alluded to the fact that if negotiations fail, cooperation on home affairs and security could be withdrawn. Is that likely?
Well, it would be sheer madness. I joined the police in 1977, where international crime was not really a major issue. It was far harder to move around. It was far harder to move money from one country to another. It was far harder to import drugs. The world has changed fundamentally. This was before the internet. We now have movement of money and people in nanoseconds. You cannot police in isolation. It has to be a joint effort. One of the great benefits of the membership and the growing membership of the EU was the ability for police forces to act as one against what is now an international, indeed a global threat.
Do you think we live in a completely different world now? Should we expect an act of terrorism, an attack every week?
Well, we need to deal with new threats and we need to adapt. Terrorism changes, policing changes. We need to be ahead of the game to predict what happens next. The biggest challenge in the nature of this new threat is its disorganisation. People decide to become a terrorist. They don't tell head office. If you wanted to be a member of the IRA, you had to sign the Green Book. You were subject to discipline. This is the opposite end of that. This is very different. So we have to adapt to deal with that, which is why we cannot prevent, the police services across Europe cannot prevent every single attack. They have been very successful across Europe and in this country by working together, working with intelligence services in preventing many atrocities. That will continue. Some will get through, so we have to be very well trained to react quickly. And you saw in London Bridge a routinely unarmed police service responding and shooting 3 terrorists dead within 8 minutes, which is quite a fast response anywhere in the United Kingdom. So we have to develop our response tactics to become far more sophisticated, but we have to work with communities to get that critical piece of intelligence that will prevent an attack, and that applies universally.
You were Chief Constable in Northern Ireland at a critical time in the peace process. Now the institutions that were born from the peace agreement of 1998 have collapsed. The negotiations to bring them back are in dire straits. Two former Prime Ministers, John Major and Tony Blair, have warned Theresa May against an alliance with politicians from the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland because they represent a part of the community, one side of the community. What do you think about this?
Well, I think both the Prime Ministers that have already spoken publicly are right. I think you have to tread very carefully when you start to interfere or potentially interfere with such a delicate situation. My sense is, if one community in Northern Ireland feels it is losing out because of this decision, which is about holding on to power in Westminster, there could be consequences. It will have to be very carefully managed. The other issue, of course, is Northern Ireland is the one part of the United Kingdom that has a land border. It's a very large land border. It's a long land border. The history tells us it is impossible to close a border completely. And of course, that debate will be right at the top of the agenda in the Brexit negotiations.
If Britain comes out of the customs union during the Brexit process. This land border between the EU and the UK, which is in Northern Ireland, may have to be policed again. Throughout the Troubles, at the critical times of the conflict, there were issues in policing that border. Will that come again?
Well, that's a really interesting question. There was no sensible debate about that issue in the build-up to the referendum. I tried to generate a debate. The Northern Ireland Secretary of State at the time was silent on the issue, apart from it'll be the same. Well, it may not be the same because we are a different country, or we will be a different country to the Republic of Ireland in terms of membership of the EU. If we're out of a customs union, it makes sense that there has to be some control on that border. If one also remembers, the most ridiculous part of the whole debate around the referendum was it was focused on one thing: immigration. You cannot control immigration if you leave a land border open. So the notion that if that was a critical issue, you leave a back door completely open is simply bonkers. It's not something that makes any sense. The problem is there was no sensible debate, and there has been no thinking that I'm aware of to look at how one would deal with that issue. If the border closes, that will be a significant development in terms of the peace process and its fragility.
Could peace in Northern Ireland be at stake after Brexit?
I think the answer to that is no, because the citizens of Northern Ireland will not let it happen. We're in a very different place. I am not persuaded you will see a return to any significant violence. I am concerned that those who are still wedded to violence will see this as an opportunity, and the police service in Northern Ireland and the governments will have to work very hard to stop that happening, as will the Republic.
Sir Hugh Orde, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching France 24. Stay with us, the news coming up next.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyse how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.